A true story. Jeffrey Epstein's story did not begin with scandal. It began quietly in a way that would later make his rise, and his protection, more difficult to understand. Born in 1953 in Brooklyn, New York, Epstein came from a modest, working-class Jewish family. There was nothing in his early life that suggested he would one day become one of the most controversial figures of the modern era. No inherited empire, no famous surname, no public path to extreme wealth. What Epstein did have, according to people who later studied him, was an unusual ability to read power. He understood early that influence was not always visible, and that the most powerful people often preferred to remain in the background. In the 1970s, Epstein worked as a teacher at a private school, despite lacking traditional credentials. Even at this stage, his ability to gain trust from elite institutions raised questions later. How did doors open so easily for someone with such limited formal background? That question would follow Epstein for the rest of his life. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, Epstein transitioned into finance. He presented himself as a gifted strategist, someone who could manage money for the ultra-wealthy. Unlike most financial professionals, Epstein did not advertise his services. He did not run public hedge funds. He did not explain his methods in detail. He claimed exclusivity, and exclusivity created allure. Very little about Epstein's fortune was transparent. Even investigators later struggled to determine exactly how he made his money. What is known is that he attached himself to powerful individuals and institutions, gradually embedding himself into circles where questions were rarely asked publicly. Epstein learned something critical. When powerful people trust you, others stop questioning you. As his wealth grew, so did his properties. His Manhattan mansion became one of the largest private residences in the city. In Palm Beach, Florida, he purchased a massive estate close to the ocean. In New Mexico, he owned a ranch. In Paris, he had a residence near cultural centers. And in the U.S. Virgin Islands, he acquired a private island that would later become infamous. These properties were not merely homes. They were controlled environments. They were places where Epstein set the rules, chose who entered, and dictated what was seen. Epstein cultivated a public image of a philanthropist and intellectual patron. He donated to universities, funded scientific research, and hosted discussions on complex topics like physics, economics, and artificial intelligence. He surrounded himself with academics and thinkers, lending himself an image of seriousness and legitimacy. This image worked. Institutions accepted his money. Conferences welcomed him. Invitations arrived without hesitation. Epstein positioned himself not as a celebrity, but as a connector, a man who brought important people together. Meanwhile, another side of his life remained largely invisible. In Palm Beach, Florida, Epstein's mansion became the center of quiet activity that would not draw attention for years. Young girls, many from financially vulnerable backgrounds, were recruited under the promise of easy money. The task was described simply: a massage. The pay, often hundreds of dollars in cash, was far more than typical part-time work for teenagers. According to later sworn testimony, the pattern was deliberate. Girls were told they could earn more if they brought friends. There were few questions asked. There were no background checks. There was no formal employment structure. What happened inside the mansion, according to court documents and victim statements, went far beyond what had been promised. But at the time, no alarms were publicly raised. Epstein's social status acted as a shield. His wealth discouraged suspicion. His connections created hesitation. When girls spoke quietly among themselves, many believed no one would listen. And for a long time, no one did. In the early 2000s, local police in Palm Beach began to notice reports that did not align with Epstein's public image. The allegations came from multiple sources and followed similar patterns. Detectives took the unusual step of investigating a man whose wealth and influence far exceeded most local cases. The investigation that followed was detailed. Police interviewed victims, documented statements, and built a case that, by their assessment, warranted serious felony charges. This should have been the moment when Epstein's protection failed. Instead, it became the moment when the system bent. The case moved beyond local law enforcement and into the federal legal system. That transition, which often signals stronger accountability, produced the opposite result. Behind closed doors, negotiations took place that would not become public knowledge for years. In 2008, Jeffrey Epstein entered into a plea agreement that would later be described by legal experts as extraordinary. He pleaded guilty to a state charge of solicitation of a minor. The punishment was limited, 13 months in jail, with work release privileges that allowed him to leave custody for much of the day. More troubling was what the agreement contained beyond the sentence. The deal included protections for unnamed individuals who might otherwise have faced investigation. It also bypassed the requirement to notify victims, a violation of victims' rights that would later become central to legal challenges. At the time, the public knew almost nothing. To most of the world, Epstein had faced consequences and moved on. He returned to his properties. He resumed travel. He re-entered elite social spaces. Donations continued. Invitations continued. For the victims, the message was devastating. Their stories had been reduced to footnotes. The system had acknowledged wrongdoing without acknowledging them. This was not merely a legal failure. It was a moral one. For nearly a decade, Epstein lived openly, protected not by secrecy alone, but by indifference. Institutions that had the power to question him chose not to. The discomfort of asking questions outweighed the discomfort of ignoring rumors. But documents do not disappear. Civil lawsuits quietly progressed. Journalists began digging. Survivors, many of whom had carried their trauma in silence, began to speak again. This time they found allies. The term Epstein Files did not refer to a single document or secret list. It referred to a growing body of records. Depositions, flight logs, emails, financial transactions, and sworn testimony. These were not internet theories. They were legal artifacts. Each document added weight. Each testimony added clarity. By the late 2010s, the silence surrounding Epstein was no longer sustainable. And for the first time, the protection he had relied on for decades began to crack. The most disturbing part of Jeffrey Epstein's story is not only what he is accused of doing, but how long he was able to do it without interruption. Abuse does not survive for years without help. It survives through silence, hesitation, and institutional failure. Session 2 is not about Epstein alone. It is about the system that allowed him to continue. After the 2008 plea deal, Epstein did not disappear. He did not retreat into obscurity. He did not live the life of a disgraced man. Instead, he returned to a world that largely accepted him back. His punishment was so limited that many people outside Palm Beach never even knew he had been convicted of a crime involving a minor. This was not accidental. The plea agreement was structured to minimize attention. Federal charges were avoided. Court proceedings were quiet. Media coverage was limited. Epstein's legal consequences were reduced to a brief interruption, not an ending. For the young women who had reported him, the experience was devastating. Many had risked humiliation, retaliation, and disbelief by speaking to police. They expected protection. Instead, they watched Epstein regain freedom while they carried lifelong consequences. Some survivors later described this moment as more traumatic than the abuse itself. It taught them that the system valued power over truth. Epstein's work release arrangement became a symbol of inequality. While serving his sentence, he was allowed to leave jail for extended hours, return to his office, and continue managing his affairs. This privilege was rarely granted to ordinary offenders, especially those convicted of crimes involving minors. The message was unmistakable. Consequences are flexible when influence is involved. As Epstein resumed his life, institutions faced a choice. They could question his past, or they could accept his money and connections. Many chose the latter. Universities continued to associate with him. Social figures continued to invite him. Conferences continued to list him as a guest. This was not necessarily because people approved of his actions, but because confronting them was uncomfortable. Silence was easier. Meanwhile, Epstein's private world continued operating largely unchanged. According to later court filings, recruitment patterns resumed. Young women were still being approached. Cash payments continued. Travel continued. What made Epstein's operation particularly difficult to expose was its informality. There were no contracts, no written instructions, no formal organization. Everything was built on personal interaction, cash payments, and silence. This structure created plausible deniability. When questions arose, there was always distance between Epstein and direct responsibility. When people suspected wrongdoing, they lacked documentation. But survivors remembered. Throughout the 2010s, civil lawsuits began to surface. These cases did not rely on criminal standards of proof, which require guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Civil cases operate on a lower threshold, allowing victims to seek accountability even when prosecutors decline to act. Depositions were taken under oath. Details were recorded. Patterns emerged. The same locations appeared repeatedly. The same methods were described independently by different women. The same timeline repeated across testimonies. These were not isolated stories. They were consistent narratives. One of the most important aspects of the Epstein Files is that they preserved these sworn statements. Even when cases were sealed or settled, records remained. Over time, journalists and legal advocates pieced them together. The role of investigative journalism cannot be overstated. Reporters revisited old police reports, interviewed victims who had been dismissed, and uncovered the existence of the secret plea deal. When these findings were published, public reaction was swift and intense. The question was no longer whether Epstein had abused minors. That was legally established. The question was how he had been protected. Attention turned to prosecutors, institutions, and regulators. Why had federal charges been dropped? Why were victims not informed? Why were safeguards ignored? Legal experts described the plea deal as extraordinary and deeply troubling. Victims' rights advocates argued that it represented a systemic failure, not a procedural mistake. As pressure grew, Epstein's past resurfaced into public view. The protection he once enjoyed began to weaken. Associations that once seemed harmless now appeared negligent. His name became radioactive. But Epstein still had one powerful defense: time. Years had passed since many of the alleged crimes. Evidence was harder to collect. Memories were challenged. Some victims had moved on, unwilling to relive trauma. Others feared retaliation or disbelief. Yet enough evidence remained to reopen scrutiny. In 2019, federal authorities finally acted. Epstein was arrested and charged with sex trafficking minors across state lines. This time, there would be no quiet resolution. The indictment was detailed. The language was severe. For the first time, Epstein faced the possibility of a full federal trial. The arrest sent shockwaves through elite circles. People who had once dismissed the case as resolved now distanced themselves. Institutions issued statements. Donations were questioned. Associations were quietly severed. But even at this stage, the focus was often misplaced. Public attention turned immediately to speculation about who else might be involved. Lists circulated online. Names were debated. Rumors flourished. This distracted from what the Epstein Files actually represented. They were not proof of universal guilt. They were evidence of systemic neglect. Many names appeared in documents for reasons unrelated to criminal behavior. Association does not equal accusation. Flight logs do not equal wrongdoing. Legal records require careful interpretation. Courts, not public opinion, determine guilt. What the files undeniably showed was that Epstein did not operate in isolation. He relied on enablers, not always knowingly but consistently. He relied on people who did not ask questions, on institutions that valued donations, on legal systems that preferred quiet resolutions. Most of all, he relied on the assumption that teenage girls would not be believed. That assumption proved tragically accurate for years. As Epstein awaited trial in a New York detention facility, survivors prepared themselves for something they had waited decades to see: public accountability. They hoped to testify. They hoped to be heard. They hoped that this time the system would not turn away. The trial promised answers. promised testimony under oath, promised cross-examination, promised exposure of how power operates behind closed doors. Those promises would never be fulfilled. When Jeffrey Epstein was arrested in July 2019, it felt to many like history correcting itself. For years, survivors had carried the burden of knowing that the man who abused them lived freely, protected by wealth and influence. His arrest signaled something rare, delayed accountability, but it also exposed how fragile justice can be when it finally arrives. Federal prosecutors charged Epstein with sex trafficking of minors. The indictment described a pattern of abuse that stretched across years and locations, involving recruitment, manipulation, and payments designed to silence victims. Unlike the 2008 case, this was not limited to a single state. It acknowledged a system that crossed borders and exploited vulnerabilities. Epstein pleaded not guilty. He was denied bail and placed in the Metropolitan Correctional Center in New York. This was not a typical environment for someone of his social status. For the first time in decades, Epstein was isolated from the world that had protected him. Outside the jail, public reaction was intense. Media coverage was constant. Survivors spoke openly. Journalists analyzed every detail of his past. The case became a symbol of reckoning, not just for Epstein, but for how society treats powerful offenders. Attention quickly turned to what Epstein might reveal if the case went to trial. Unlike civil lawsuits, criminal trials involve compulsory testimony, evidence rules, and cross-examination. Epstein would be questioned under oath. Documents would be examined publicly. Networks of influence could be exposed. For many observers, this was the most dangerous moment of Epstein's life. Not because of the charges, but because of what he knew. The idea that Epstein held secrets about powerful people fueled speculation. It is important to state clearly that speculation is not evidence. Courts operate on proof, not suspicion. But the anticipation of testimony was real. The potential consequences were enormous. Survivors prepared themselves emotionally. Many had waited years to speak in a courtroom, not as plaintiffs seeking settlements, but as witnesses seeking truth. They wanted to be seen. They wanted their words recorded permanently in legal history. That opportunity was short-lived. On August 10, 2019, less than a month after his arrest, Jeffrey Epstein was found unresponsive in his jail cell. He was pronounced dead shortly afterward. Authorities ruled his death a suicide by hanging. The news spread instantly across the world. Almost immediately, the questions began. Epstein had previously been placed on suicide watch after an earlier incident. That watch had been removed shortly before his death. Guards assigned to check on him reportedly failed to do so at required intervals. Surveillance cameras malfunctioned. Records were falsified. Each failure alone might have been explained. Together, they formed a pattern of negligence that demanded scrutiny. The Department of Justice launched investigations. The FBI examined the circumstances. The guards on duty were later charged with falsifying records. Institutional failures were acknowledged publicly. But acknowledgement did not bring closure. Epstein's death terminated the criminal case against him. No trial, no testimony, no cross-examination, no verdict. For survivors, it was a devastating loss. The man who had controlled their silence now escaped accountability entirely. The system had failed them again, this time permanently. Public reaction shifted from anger to suspicion. Conspiracy theories flourished online. Claims circulated rapidly, often without evidence. While distrust in institutions was understandable given the failures, misinformation spread just as quickly as facts. This created a new problem. The focus shifted away from survivors and toward speculation. The legal record was overshadowed by rumor. Names were circulated irresponsibly. Innocent associations were treated as proof of guilt. This environment made serious investigation more difficult, not easier. The reality is more complex and more troubling than any single theory. Epstein's death was the result of documented failures within a correctional facility. Those failures reflect systemic issues, understaffing, negligence, procedural breakdowns, not necessarily coordinated conspiracy. What is certain is this: Epstein's death protected more than himself. It protected secrets, networks, and uncomfortable truths that would have been examined under oath. After his death, attention turned fully to the Epstein Files. These files were not hidden vaults suddenly opened. They were records that had existed for years: court filings, depositions, settlement agreements, and sealed documents that slowly became public through legal processes. Journalists and legal analysts reviewed them carefully. Patterns emerged again. The files documented how Epstein recruited victims, how he paid them, how he encouraged silence, how complaints were dismissed, how opportunities to stop him were missed repeatedly. They also documented something equally important: the limits of the law. Many individuals named in the files were never accused of crimes. Some were mentioned in passing. Some were referenced by victims without corroboration. Some were included due to proximity, not participation. This distinction matters. Justice is not served by replacing silence with accusation without evidence. Survivors themselves have emphasized this point repeatedly. They want truth, not chaos. Civil lawsuits against Epstein's estate continued after his death. In 2021, his estate agreed to a settlement compensating victims. While financial compensation cannot undo harm, it represented official acknowledgement of wrongdoing. But money does not answer questions. Why was Epstein allowed to operate for so long? Why were warnings ignored? Why were victims dismissed? Why did accountability arrive only after irreversible damage? The Epstein Files do not provide all answers. They provide a map of failure. They show how systems designed to protect can instead shield harm. They reveal how power distorts accountability. They demonstrate how silence is maintained, not through threats alone, but through disbelief and inconvenience. Epstein's death marked the end of a man, but not the end of the story. The files remain. The testimony remains. The failures remain. And so do the survivors. They continue to speak not because it is easy, but because silence once protected the wrong person. The Epstein case is not a mystery waiting to be solved by speculation. It is a lesson waiting to be learned. After Jeffrey Epstein's death, the focus of public attention shifted almost entirely to the documents that survived him. With the criminal case closed, the legal system could no longer extract testimony from the central figure. What remained were records, thousands of pages accumulated over decades. These records came to be known collectively as the Epstein Files. The term itself was misleading. There was no single master file, no secret list locked away in a vault. Instead, the Epstein Files consisted of civil court filings, depositions taken under oath, financial records, flight logs, emails, police reports, and settlement documents. Many had existed for years, some under seal, others buried in legal archives. When portions of these documents were unsealed through court orders, they entered the public domain. This moment was widely misunderstood. Unsealing documents does not mean new crimes were discovered. It means records that already existed were made accessible. Their contents required careful reading, context, and legal understanding. Unfortunately, nuance rarely survives public outrage. Names appeared in the documents and immediately conclusions were drawn. This was one of the most damaging distortions of the Epstein case. Being named in a legal document does not imply guilt. In civil litigation, names can appear for many reasons: association, scheduling, travel, communication, or secondhand mention. Some individuals were referenced because victims encountered them socially. Others were mentioned because their names came up during questioning. Some were included because Epstein used their names to create legitimacy, whether truthfully or not. Courts recognize this distinction. Social media does not. As public interest intensified, speculation overtook verification. Lists circulated without context. Innocent associations were treated as evidence. Denials were dismissed as cover-ups. The seriousness of the case was diluted by misinformation. This chaos did not serve justice. It served distraction. Survivors and their advocates repeatedly warned against this approach. They emphasized that accountability must be grounded in evidence, not rumor. They stressed that misdirected accusations could harm innocent people while allowing systemic failures to go unexamined. The real importance of the Epstein files lay elsewhere. They showed patterns of institutional failure. They showed how warnings were ignored. They showed how victims were minimized. They documented how Epstein leveraged respectability to avoid scrutiny. Financial records revealed payments structured to avoid detection. Travel logs showed frequent movement across jurisdictions, complicating law enforcement oversight. Settlement agreements demonstrated how money was used to contain exposure rather than address harm. One of the most revealing aspects of the files was how often Epstein's behavior had been noticed and dismissed. Staff observed unusual activity. Community members heard rumors. Law enforcement received complaints. Yet intervention was delayed again and again. This is not uncommon in cases involving powerful individuals. Systems are often designed to handle ordinary offenders, not wealthy ones with legal teams, social capital, and institutional relationships. Epstein exploited this gap expertly. Another major focus of the files was the role of intermediaries. According to sworn testimony, Epstein rarely acted alone. Recruitment often involved young women who were themselves exploited and then encouraged to recruit others. This created layers of responsibility that blurred legal clarity. This structure benefited Epstein. It distanced him from direct action and complicated prosecution. It also trapped victims in cycles of guilt and fear, making them less likely to come forward. Civil cases attempted to address this complexity, but they had limits. Settlements provided compensation, not answers. Sealed agreements protected privacy, but also obscured accountability. After Epstein's death, his estate became the target of litigation. Courts ruled that his wealth, accumulated through opaque means, should be used to compensate victims. In 2021, a settlement fund was established. For some survivors, this represented validation. For others, it felt insufficient. No amount of money could replace justice delayed and denied. Public institutions also faced scrutiny. Prosecutors were questioned about the 2008 plea deal. Internal reviews acknowledged failures in judgment and process. Yet accountability remained limited. No senior officials faced criminal consequences. This outcome reinforced a troubling pattern. When systems fail the vulnerable, consequences are often absorbed quietly. The Epstein case also forced a broader conversation about consent, power, and exploitation. Many victims were teenagers, legally unable to consent. Others were young adults in situations of coercion, dependency, or manipulation. The abuse was not always violent, but it was always unequal. Understanding this distinction is crucial. Exploitation does not require force. It requires imbalance. Epstein understood this well. The files documented how he targeted vulnerability, financial insecurity, emotional isolation, youth, ambition. These traits were not weaknesses, they were opportunities he exploited. Yet public discourse often focused elsewhere. Sensational headlines prioritized scandal over substance. The structural failures that enabled Epstein were overshadowed by obsession with individual names. This misdirection benefited no one except those who preferred silence. Survivors continued to speak, often at great personal cost. They faced online harassment, disbelief, and re-traumatization. Many expressed frustration that their experiences were being reduced to conspiracy fuel rather than catalysts for reform. Their message was consistent. Focus on systems, not spectacle. The Epstein files are valuable not because they implicate famous people, but because they document how abuse can hide in plain sight when power goes unquestioned. They show how institutions protect themselves first. They show how victims are treated as liabilities. They show how accountability can be negotiated away. This is the real lesson. As years passed, interest in the Epstein case did not fade. It evolved. The conversation shifted from who was involved to how do we prevent this from happening again? That question remains largely unanswered. Despite increased awareness, many of the conditions that enabled Epstein still exist. Wealth still buys silence. Influence still delays investigation. Victims still face skepticism. The files are not a conclusion. They are a warning. They remind us that justice is not automatic. It must be demanded, protected, and enforced, especially when the accused are powerful. Jeffrey Epstein is gone, but the system that allowed him to operate remains very much alive. When Jeffrey Epstein died in a jail cell in August 2019, many people believed the story had ended. In reality, his death marked the beginning of a deeper and more uncomfortable chapter. Without a trial, without testimony, and without a verdict, the responsibility of understanding what happened shifted from courts to history. The Epstein Files became a permanent record of failure. Not failure of evidence, not failure of victims, but failure of systems meant to protect the vulnerable and restrain the powerful. Many survivors described a familiar pattern. When they were young, poor, or unknown, their voices were doubted. When Epstein was wealthy, connected, and respected, his reputation shielded him. This imbalance was not accidental. It was structural. The files showed how institutions rationalized inaction. Prosecutors weighed risk. Universities weighed donations. Social circles weighed reputation. Each decision, taken alone, appeared pragmatic. Together, they created protection for abuse. This is how harm persists without conspiracy. Persists through hesitation. One of the most important lessons of the Epstein Files is that silence does not require malice. It only requires comfort. People looked away because looking was inconvenient. They assumed someone else would act. They believed consequences were someone else's responsibility. By the time accountability arrived, the damage was irreversible. In the aftermath, reforms were proposed. Victims' rights laws were strengthened. Non-prosecution agreements came under greater scrutiny. Media organizations re-examined how they cover allegations involving powerful figures. Public awareness increased. These changes matter, but they are fragile. Systems tend to revert when attention fades. The Epstein case also reshaped conversations around exploitation. It highlighted that abuse does not always appear violent or dramatic. Often, it hides behind politeness, money, and perceived opportunity. Consent becomes complicated when power is unequal. Silence becomes survival. Understanding this requires empathy, not spectacle. Unfortunately, much of the public response moved in the opposite direction. Online discourse often prioritized shock over substance. The term Epstein Files became a magnet for conspiracy rather than reflection. Sensationalism replaced accountability. This shift diluted the real lessons. Survivors repeatedly expressed frustration that their experiences were being overshadowed by theories and false certainty. They did not want mythology. They wanted recognition. They wanted reform. They wanted assurance that what happened to them would not be repeated. Their courage deserves respect. Another uncomfortable truth emerged from the files. Epstein was not unique. He was extreme but not isolated. His behavior exploited gaps that exist everywhere. Gaps between wealth and law, influence and oversight, credibility and truth. Removing one individual does not close those gaps. The Epstein Files serve as documentation, not closure. They remind us that systems must be challenged actively, not trusted blindly. They demonstrate how easily justice can be negotiated away when inconvenience outweighs principle. Perhaps the most troubling aspect of the case is how many opportunities existed to stop it earlier. Warnings were issued. Complaints were filed. Patterns were visible. Each time, intervention was delayed. Each delay multiplied harm. This is the cost of disbelief. As years pass, Epstein's name will fade from headlines. But the structures that enabled him will not disappear automatically. They persist wherever power operates without transparency, wherever money purchases silence, wherever victims are required to be perfect to be believed. The files ask an uncomfortable question. If this could happen so openly, for so long, what else is being ignored right now? There is no satisfying ending to the Epstein story. That itself is the ending. No trial, no testimony, no final accounting. Only records, only voices that refuse to disappear. Only lessons that must be remembered deliberately, because forgetting would be easier. The Epstein Files are not about curiosity. They are about responsibility. They demand that institutions choose accountability over comfort, truth over convenience, and protection over reputation. Whether that demand is answered remains an open question. History will judge not only Jeffrey Epstein, but everyone who had the power to stop him and chose not to. And the true legacy of the Epstein Files will depend on whether society learns from them or allows silence to win again. The story of Jeffrey Epstein does not end with his death in August 2019. In truth, it continues in the records, the testimonies, and the unresolved questions that remain decades after his rise to wealth and influence. To understand Epstein's legacy, one must look beyond headlines, beyond rumor, and beyond sensationalized lists of names. The real story lies in how systems failed repeatedly, how power can shield wrongdoing, and how the voices of victims persist even when institutions attempt to silence them. From the earliest days of Epstein's career, his trajectory was defined by a combination of ambition, social intelligence, and a meticulous understanding of influence. He was not born into wealth or privilege. He did not inherit power. Yet, through charm, calculation, and strategic alliances, he moved seamlessly among the richest and most powerful circles in the world. Universities welcomed his donations. Conferences valued his presence. Social elites accepted his hospitality. To outsiders, Epstein appeared untouchable, respected, and even philanthropic. That image, carefully cultivated over decades, allowed him to operate largely beyond scrutiny. Yet beneath the surface, a pattern of exploitation persisted. The recruitment and abuse of young women, documented in multiple legal filings, reports, and depositions, was not a matter of isolated incidents. It was systemic. The Epstein Files reveal repeated methods, repeated locations, and repeated failures of oversight. The mechanisms of abuse were as much about opportunity and manipulation as they were about secrecy. Epstein relied not on violence alone but on power imbalances, financial leverage, and the assumption that those harmed would not be believed. This exploitation highlights a fundamental truth about abuse. It thrives when institutions prioritize convenience over justice. The failures were not limited to law enforcement. Schools, universities, charities, and private organizations all intersected with Epstein. Epstein's life in ways that allowed him to avoid accountability. While some of these institutions may have acted unknowingly, the cumulative effect was protective. Reports that should have raised alarms were dismissed. Complaints that should have triggered investigation were minimized. Each missed opportunity reinforced a structure in which Epstein's behavior could continue unchecked. This repetition underscores a troubling reality. Abuse often persists not because of clever concealment alone, but because systems are unprepared or unwilling to confront those in power. Epstein's 2008 plea deal serves as a critical example of systemic failure. The agreement, which allowed him to avoid federal prosecution and limited his jail sentence, remains one of the most controversial legal decisions in modern history. For the victims, it was devastating. Years of courage, reporting, and testimony seemed to have little effect against the combination of wealth, influence, and institutional discretion. While the plea deal was technically legal, its moral and social implications were profound. It demonstrated that legal outcomes can be shaped by negotiation, leverage, and selective discretion, sometimes at the expense of justice for the vulnerable. Yet the Epstein Files are more than evidence of wrongdoing. They are also a record of resilience. The survivors' persistence in speaking out, filing civil suits, and cooperating with journalists ensured that the truth could not be fully erased. Even when criminal accountability failed temporarily, the accumulation of documents, court records, and testimonies preserved their stories. These records serve as a safeguard against complete erasure of the victims' experiences. They are a testament to the power of persistence and a reminder that documentation matters, even when immediate justice seems impossible. The arrest of Epstein in July 2019 represented a fleeting moment of potential accountability. Federal authorities charged him with sex trafficking of minors, outlining a network of abuse that spanned states and countries. The indictment highlighted the systemic nature of his operations, demonstrating how exploitation can extend across borders when left unchecked. This moment offered hope for the survivors, for the legal system, and for society's ability to confront abuse at its highest levels. Yet the hope was short-lived. Epstein's death in custody eliminated the possibility of a criminal trial. Testimonies were never publicly heard. Questions were left unanswered. For many, this represented the final instance in which the system failed to deliver justice. Even after Epstein's death, the impact of the files continued to resonate. Media scrutiny intensified, public discourse evolved, and civil litigation provided some measure of financial recompense. Yet financial settlements, while meaningful, cannot replace the public acknowledgement that a trial would have provided. Money cannot testify. Money cannot question witnesses. Money cannot create a permanent legal record in the same way that court proceedings do. The settlements represented acknowledgement of harm but not full accountability. Perhaps the most enduring lesson of the Epstein Files is about power itself. Epstein's life illustrates how influence, when combined with wealth and social capital, can manipulate the structures designed to prevent harm. Institutions often prioritize their own reputations, comfort, or convenience over the welfare of those harmed. Silence becomes a default, and inaction becomes a shield for the powerful. These lessons are not confined to Epstein's case. They are broadly applicable to many systems where inequality and influence intersect. Moreover, the files reveal the dangers of speculation and misinterpretation. When Epstein's name became synonymous with conspiracy theories, misinformation threatened to obscure the real victims' voices. Names circulated online without context, implying guilt where there was none. Proven. The real value of the Epstein Files is not in the sensationalism that surrounds them, but in the factual record they provide. Sworn testimony, legal filings, and documented patterns of abuse. They remind us that justice relies on evidence, not conjecture.